Out here, the Arizona highways don't sleep, they wait. Beneath the stars, truckers whisper about roads that shift, voices that crawl through static, and faces that follow in rearview mirrors long after the engine dies. Every mile hides something watching, and once you see it, it never forgets you. Stay with me till the end and subscribe to Verified Souls, where every story drives deeper into the dark. The first thing that went wrong was the voice that knew my name before I said a word, rising out of Channel 19 like it had been waiting in the static just for me. Like the desert itself had tuned the frequency to the one person stupid enough to answer at 2 in the morning on a stretch of Arizona asphalt so empty it felt like a dare from God. I was hauling refrigerated pallets north, cutting through the high desert where the land lifts into dark mesas and the sky stops pretending to be friendly. The kind of route dispatch calls quiet mileage, because it never throws anything on paper that can't be solved with diesel and time. But quiet is just another word for isolated when you've been awake for 18 hours, and the moon keeps stepping behind clouds like it's hiding from what it knows lives down here. It's a place that carries its own rumors, like dust under the nails. Old talk about voices on CBs that shouldn't reach as far as they do, about phantom warnings that come through in a clipped, grainy register like the 70s got trapped in the airwaves and refuses to die out here where nothing really does. I keep my CB off most nights. Too much nonsense, too many lonely men trying to fill the cab with noise so they don't have to deal with the other noise. But fatigue makes you soft, and the emptier the highway got, the more I wanted proof that someone else existed in this thin place. So when the voice slid in with a faint carrier hum, clean as a razor and old as rust, I reached to turn the volume without thinking. And that's when it said, Miles, the way my mother used to when I was a kid, and she needed me to listen. Except my mother's been dead 10 years, and this wasn't her. And the CB's orange dial reflected in the side window made my face look like it belonged to someone who'd already seen what comes next. Pull at marker 195, it said, calm, like a friend with a map. Don't wait for the bridge. And before I could form a response that made sense to anyone but me, a sign flashed by that did in fact read 195, and out ahead the road dipped over a dry wash, the sort of bridge you cross 1,000 times and never notice, unless something has turned your blood thin and taught you to notice everything. I slowed down without deciding to, hazards on, careful with the wheel because the wind had begun pushing across from the mesas, a sideways breath, and the desert smelled like cold stone and electricity, like the kind of weather that arrives without clouds. "What's your handle?" I asked, which was the wrong question, too normal, trying to make this something I could categorize, and a hiss of static lifted like fabric, and under it I heard the faintest tapping, a rhythm I couldn't place until I realized it matched my turn signal, that metronome of caution amplified and fed back to me through the radio. "Bridge is gone," the voice said, and there was a softness to the phrase like regret, like it had warned me before, and sometimes drivers hadn't listened, and the image rose uninvited of a rig easing over an empty span and finding out too late that the road had taken a breath and decided to step aside. Headlights whitewashed the guardrail. Then the road's throat opened to black, and my brights found what I wouldn't have believed on any other night. The concrete lip sheared clean, yawning into empty, a scrape of rebar like exposed nerves, and a ragged spill of asphalt that ended in nothing but a suggestion of depth, as if the desert had been chewing quietly, and I had caught it mid-bite. The wash had eaten the supports during some flash I hadn't seen, and no one had marked it yet. No flares, no angles, no squad car bleeding blue into the dust, just absence. The purest warning there is, and the thought hit me like a second heartbeat, that if I hadn't flipped the CB on, I would have found out the hard way what living inside absence feels like. "Copy," I said, because language is a habit that keeps us from falling through the floor, and I eased the rig to the shoulder and sat there with my hazards ticking like a bomb that never goes off, letting my breath catch up to me, waiting for something. Other headlights, an explanation, a nervous laugh rotated through the pipeline of voices. But the channel was empty again, the way deserts are, waiting for you to admit what you heard. Appreciate it, I added out loud, because gratitude felt like a thread I could hold, and the voice came back at once, so fast I jumped. You owed me, it said, almost playful. And that's when the cold traveled up my arms and settled in my jaw, because debt is a math I understand, and I hadn't borrowed anything from anyone who still had a use for me. Who is this? I asked. But the band slice shifted, and the words that slid through were the same as mine. Same cadence, same dryness. Who is this? Like I was talking to my own echo across a canyon, and I knew enough to look out the passenger window and see only my reflection, lit by the console, older than I like to admit. Another set of lights burned up behind me then, too fast, a box truck hauling through like the night was a dare, and I laid on the air horn, swung one arm through the windshield like he could see it. And the driver jerked alive at the last moment, squealed, pendulumed into the shoulder on the far side, and stopped with his grill kissing the broken edge, steam feathering up from the radiator like breath in winter. He came at me shaking, hands out, mouth open like a fish pulled too quick from deep water, and he said, "Christ, man," and then something in Spanish I didn't catch, because the wind carried it off. And then he just stood there looking at the nothing in front of us like he could convince it to be road again with enough staring. We put cones down from his kit because he actually had them, and I didn't, and he called it in, his dispatcher, his wife, his God, I don't know, while I sat back in my cab and stared at the CB and waited for the voice to return, because the only thing worse than hearing something impossible is not hearing it a second time and realizing you might have invented your own salvation. It came back low, like someone whispering across a wide room, "Mile marker 195," and the syllables stretched, worn thin by use. And I said, "I know," almost angry, and the voice breathed out a laugh that wasn't mine, wasn't anyone living's idea of humor, more like a glitch stitched to a memory. And then it said my last name the way the DMV says it, clinical, as if it had learned me from a file. I turned the radio off then, pulled the mic from its clip, and set it on the passenger seat, like you put down a phone you don't want to answer anymore, but can't bring yourself to break. And that's when the tapping didn't stop, but shifted. A new rhythm, traveling through the cab from somewhere you don't want any rhythms to come from. The sleeper wall. At first I thought it was a loose strap, a bottle cap, road vibration, anything rational, because even out here where reason shrinks, you keep it around like a lucky coin. But the taps organized, 2 short, 1 long, pause, repeat, and then the pause got shorter, like whoever was improvising forgot the rest of the song and just wanted me to notice. I slid behind the seat and pulled the curtain aside and stared into the dark square of the sleeper, my own breath bouncing back at me. And for a second, in the hung light from the dash, I thought I saw a pale plane at the far wall like paper tacked up where there shouldn't be any paper. But when I reached and touched it, it wasn't paper at all but glossy plastic, warm, sticky at the edges, and I peeled it back and held my phone light to it without asking permission from whatever part of myself usually votes no. It was a CB frequency chart, the old kind, printed from a dot matrix, the paper holes still visible in the margin, laminated cheap, annotated in pencil with mile markers and dates, and the line for 19 had been circled over and over until the circle tore the lamination and dug into the paper like somebody wanted to wear a groove into the night itself. In the lower corner, under a coffee ring that had burned itself into the laminate like a tiny planet, a name was written, my name, the last 4 letters smudged, as if someone had tried to rub them away and failed, and a second circle around 195 connected to it with a line like a map legend says, "You are here when you'd rather be anywhere else." I didn't install that chart. This was a leased unit out of Phoenix. Fleet turnover so fast I still hadn't scraped the ghost of the last guy's air freshener off the vent. And it hit me like a little bubble rising from deep water that whoever drove this cab before me had been warned at this same mile, on this same channel, and had decided to leave the warning behind in case the road didn't learn. The other driver knocked on my door then, timid like you approach a sleeping bear, and asked if I was hearing the music, which is not a phrase you want to hear at 2 a.m. on a broken bridge. But I did faint now, less a song than a pattern, and I realized it wasn't tapping anymore but a drum, small, far away, like something ceremonial beating time in the belly of the Wash, and the desert in this part of the state has its own history, a long one that doesn't care if you believe in it. He crossed himself, and wouldn't look out over the gap, and I couldn't blame him. So we stood shoulder to shoulder in 2 cones of headlight, and waited for the first trooper to crest the hill, lights off, cautious, like a man approaching an animal he might spook into bolting. And by the time the trooper set flares and closed the approach, the music had braided back into the night, and my CB sat quiet and innocent, like a dog that hasn't chewed the couch. The trooper took statements and asked if either of us had called it in before we stopped, and when we both shook our heads, he glanced at my dash where the mic cord hung like a vine, and asked if I'd had the radio on, like he was working through a list he didn't like, and I said I had, and he didn't write that down, which told me he already knew the answer he'd decided to accept. I left first, nosed the rig into a 3-point turn with the kind of care that makes your shoulders ache, took the detour he pointed me to, a thin county line that added an hour and felt like it had been paved with shovel blades, and the CB stayed dead until the sky began to lighten, and the land went from black to blue, to a color you don't have a name for because it only exists between things. At a truck stop outside Holbrook, the cashier handed me a coffee that tasted like it had been trying to be something else when it gave up. And when I asked about the bridge, she didn't blink, said the Wash had taken it 2 hours earlier, said 2 rigs had reported a warning and 1 had nearly gone over, and then she looked at my mic through the window like you look at a dog that's watching a door before somebody knocks, on a bulletin board by the restrooms, among thumbtacked business cards and lost cat notices that made no sense this far out. Someone had pinned a photocopy of a CB channel guide. Old fonts, old ink. The circle around 19 traced so hard the copy machine had picked up the indent as a shadow. And at the bottom, in a neat hand, if it says your name, listen. I stood there longer than I should, the coffee going cool in my hand, and realized I wasn't angry at the voice for using me like a relay, for threading the desert's old warnings through my night. I was angry at how easily I had listened, at how quickly the road could make a believer out of a man who prefers facts, schedules, proof that the next mile is still a mile and not a trick of light. Back in the cab, before rolling out, I reached for the mic and didn't key it, just held it so the cord straightened, and spoke anyway, into the hush that isn't silence but the sound of things waiting. "You're paid," I said, because owing is a weight and I wanted it off me, and the carrier hummed a fraction louder, the way a refrigerator hums when the compressor kicks, and that could have been nothing at all, the dumb physics of wire and power, but the hairs on my arms lifted as if the desert had leaned in to hear. The second time Arizona tried to make me vanish, it didn't use a voice or a light or some trick of the desert. It used a rest area that looked exactly like safety, lit and clean and watched, the kind of place you pull into without thinking because tired minds prefer fluorescent certainty over the dark, and that's how trouble likes you best. It was a small site off I-8, east of Yuma, but still within the county's reach. A flat concrete island with 2 buildings, a soda machine humming like a tame animal, and a landscape strip of mesquite and crushed granite that always feels performative in places that want you to forget their wilderness with plumbing. I was westbound with a half load of dry goods and a clock that said I had 30 minutes to spare before the next legal stop, and the night had that baked metal chill the desert gets after the heat leaves the ground like a secret. So I swung in, parked under the brightest lamp, and told myself I would be 10 minutes. A quick walk, a splash of water, back on the road before my bones remembered how good stillness can be. There were 2 other trucks and a minivan with an out-of-state plate. Nobody standing around, nobody begging smokes or conversation. Just the quiet presence of people who also wanted the night to ignore them, which is always when the night pays attention. Inside the men's room, the echo was wrong. Too hollow for the size, like there was more space hiding behind the tile than the blueprints admitted. And when the faucet ran, the pipes sang a thin metallic tone that made the back of my teeth itch. But I chalked it up to old infrastructure and the way exhaustion can turn sound into suggestion. A notice board near the sinks carried the usual: "Don't leave pets in cars, report suspicious activity, call this number for maintenance," and a laminated sheet with a smiling couple who were the live-in caretakers, which is a comfort on paper and a rumor in practice because caretakers can't be everywhere at once, and sometimes everywhere is exactly where you need someone to be. When I stepped back into the night, the lamp above my hood flickered once, steady. Once again, steady, then settled into a rhythm that matched nothing else around it. And the kind of cold that isn't weather moved over my scalp. That alert animal cold that means a plan is happening nearby that doesn't involve your consent. A man in a reflective vest stood by the trash can midway down the lot, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind him like security on break, except there was no logo on the vest and no truck or car that made sense for him, and he didn't look at me so much as past me, like he was counting doors and exits and deciding which one I would prefer right before blocking it. Another man appeared on the opposite side of the building, younger, clean ball cap, a walk that said, harmless if you were the kind of person who reads bodies the way the desert reads tracks, moving, slow in a curve that would bring him near my passenger side if I pretended not to notice. It's funny how tired you can be and still feel every gear in your mind mesh perfectly when the math turns ugly. 2 strangers. No ostensible reason to be there that late. Both closing angles without committing, a light that wants to be unreliable, and the certainty that if I opened the passenger door to climb in fast, a hand would be there to help me in a way I wouldn't like. A minivan door clicked, and a woman stepped out, stretched, then froze mid-motion, eyes snagging on the same geometry I saw. And in that second, our casual night selves packed up, and our survival selves took the wheel. She slid back into her seat without looking, rushed, and pressed the lock with the calm care of someone who knows noise is invitation. The vestibule glass threw back my reflection, and theirs, a triptych of ordinary shapes under artificial daylight. And that's what makes places like this dangerous. They look managed, curated into neutrality. And so you let your guard down, because who would do something bad under a camera, under a bulb, under the authority of signage that says this space belongs to everyone? I put my hand on the driver's handle and felt the tiny resistance that means it's already locked. The habit I've trained into myself with the fervor of ritual, and walked past the door like I'd forgotten something on the far side of the cab, a little loop that brought me to the back where the trailer's shadow swallowed me and, for the first time that night, made me feel invisible in a way that wasn't unpleasant. The man in the vest shifted. The younger one changed course by a foot, the way men do when they're pretending they aren't coordinating and accidentally move at the same time. And my mind produced a word I don't like using because it feels like superstition, stalking. And it landed hard enough to make my next move for me. I stepped out from the shadow and walked straight toward the blue emergency phone pedestal by the picnic area, a bright piece of theater the state installs for citizens who want to believe in rescue. And I picked it up because theater works on everyone with a conscience, and apparently on at least one person without. Because the younger man peeled away like a leaf caught by a different breeze and disappeared behind the restroom. Arizona DPS, the handset said, after 2 rings, a human voice, tired but taught to sound like a promise. And I didn't have to invent anything. I told the truth in 3 sentences. Men, angles, a light that won't settle. And while I spoke, I watched the vest man glance at the handset, like it offended him personally. "We'll send a trooper through," the voice said. And that seems small until you realize how much physics changes when a certain set of lights approaches a place like this. how many bad ideas evaporate in the heat of official presence, and I said, "Thank you," and hung up and walked back to my cab in a way that showed neither fear nor interest, because men who hunt at rest areas do not like being seen as work. Timing's a cruel comedian. A third man I hadn't clocked emerged from the Xeriscape, not from a car, but from the squat of the decorative bushes themselves, hands empty, hips angled casual, like he'd just finished a phone call in the shrubs because privacy. But I couldn't parse a route that got him there without patience. And patience is a skill of men who don't care how long it takes. I climbed in through the driver's side, key already in my fist, started the engine, and watched in the mirror as the vest man gave me a small, almost polite nod, a concession, not a surrender, which in some ways is worse because it means the game is bigger than you and isn't offended by your exit. Rolling forward, I saw the caretaker's RV at the far edge, dark, shades drawn, the sort of life that keeps bathrooms clean and lawns raked and also sleeps through things because you cannot live on high alert and expect your heart to last. And that's the slide of these places. They look maintained. And so maintenance is the story you tell yourself while the other story approaches on soft shoes. I didn't merge back to the freeway. I pulled across to the truck side of the lot and idled under a different light, phone in hand, and texted a buddy running behind me to skip the stop. No flourish, just coordinates, and a no because there's an etiquette to warnings out here where rumor travels faster than help, and both are worth sending. The trooper came in slow from the on-ramp 5 minutes later, not roaring but gliding, the way you bring a net to water that looks still, and the vest man became a walker with purpose toward the vending machine. The shrub man became a man who had always been on a phone by the shrubs, and the young man did not return, which told me what I needed to know about the simplest form of deterrence. I sat for a moment and watched the trooper walk the lot, talk to the minivan woman, her hands on 10 and 2 even while parked, which made me smile in spite of everything. And then I eased out, gave a small wave that he didn't return because his eyes were busy, and took the on-ramp with the rig feeling heavier than freight can account for. The interstate at night is a compromise between speed and certainty. You agree to move fast because the world will behave, and the world agrees nothing in particular, and the line between hazard and predator is mostly paperwork until it isn't. And that's the part they don't put on the tourism brochures. That's the part you only learn in the geometry class you take with your life. Between Yuma and Gila Bend, the desert flattens into a wide breadth, and the sky lifts high enough to forgive you a little. And the adrenaline left my hands and entered the part of memory that files under lessons. And the lesson was small and ugly and useful. Not all horror out here glows or whispers your name. Some of it wears a vest that doesn't belong to anybody and counts the steps between you and the door. At the next fuel stop, a clerk with a face like he'd seen every version of night handed me change and asked, like a weather report, if the rest area was quiet. And I said it was not. And he nodded, like a man who keeps a private atlas of places where quiet is either a gift or a trap, and he marked something in his head I couldn't see. There are stories you pass along because they entertain, and there are stories you pass along because they might move a body 3 feet to the left at the right time, and I told 2 drivers on the way out to stick to the next exit if they could, not because anything supernatural lived out there, but because 3 men did, and men can be worse when they don't need to be ghosts to disappear between lights. By the time the sun boomed up pink over the low mountains, the fear had bleached into something steadier. And I realized the part that bothered me most wasn't that I'd been a potential page in someone else's playbook. It was how normal the stage had been, how plausible, how designed for tired people to trust, and how thin the membrane was between the state's promise and the reality that promises rest while accepting what the night brings. If there's a moral, it isn't about paranoia or heroics. It's about reading spaces the way you read weather, looking for pressure drops and odd lights and men who walk diagonals where straight lines are free, and it's about remembering that the most dangerous kind of empty is the one that's been curated to look full of safety. The first time the clock bent on me, it wasn't some sci-fi shimmer or a UFO story I'd be embarrassed to repeat. It was a plain, ugly stretch of 191, where the desert doesn't care if you're late, and my dash clock jumped backward 3 minutes like it tripped over something I couldn't see, and decided time should try again. I was running a light load out of Safford toward the Four Corners route, empty sky above, the kind that makes you think about how long light travels to get here and how little that matters when your eyelids feel like they've been salted. So I did the sensible thing, coffee, radio, window cracked, to let the high desert cold dig around behind my ears and wake me where caffeine can't reach. The mile marker said 251, a green number I didn't register as special until the first flicker hit. Dash clock, phone, even the cheap digital on the dash cam all popped from 311 back to 308 like they'd been instructed by the same hand. And my body did that microscopic lean forward you do when a vehicle brakes slightly, except I wasn't braking. My foot was steady, cruise set, RPMs clean. There's a list of explanations you run through when you drive for a living and something weird happens, because ordinary is always your best friend. Power hiccup, alternator noise, electromagnetic whatever from some distant installation, a tower, a storm too far to see. But the sky was a dry bowl, and the radio static wasn't the nervous kind, just the usual desert hush between faraway voices. I told myself I imagined it, and then watched it happen again. 310 to 308. 2 minutes gone, and then returned with the confidence of a dealer palming cards you'll never prove he took. And this time I felt the road under me get slick for a thumbprint of a second, like I was running on glass, crosswinds out of nowhere pushing without sound. If it had been one clock, I would have blamed the clock. 3 devices, one wired to the rig, one battery, one GPS sync, all agreeing to disagree with the minute hand that puts you into the kind of attention that makes the world go quiet around one detail. And the detail my brain locked on was a sliver of silver to the right, half buried in the scrub just off the shoulder, exactly where you'd toss a broken thing you didn't want to see anymore. There's a pullout a quarter-mile past 251, gravel, a trash barrel on a steel pole, no sign, nothing to recommend it. And I let the rig drift into it like my decision was inevitable, put the hazards on, stepped down into cold that felt older than the highway. And the quiet had that strange pressure to it, like a room after someone stops talking mid-sentence. The object was a watch, face up, dirt-stained, stopped at 3:08 with the kind of stubbornness that looks like a joke if you're tired enough to think the world is making specific points at you, and I picked it up and turned it over expecting a novelty engraving or a prank, and instead found the back plate scratched to hell, letters scored in with something sharp. Leave it. I could have. I should have. But humans don't believe other people's warnings until they feel like their own. And the simple act of holding that weight, stupid ounces of steel and glass, in my palm made it personal, like an object brought into a home that now demands attention and dusting and whatever else haunted things require to justify themselves. While I stood there pretending to weigh my options, my rig ticked softly, a sound machines make when cooling, and from the opposite ditch came another glint, then another. And when my eyes adjusted, I realized the pullout and the 100 yards around it were littered with watches, half buried, wristbands frayed, faces stared blind at a single number like an unmarked graveyard that had standardized its epitaph. You hear stories on long runs, the kind that keep you awake without caffeine because they're built out of coincidence and fatigue and the desert's talent for arranging things into shapes that look like intelligence. And I had heard something about 191, a stretch that eats minutes, a mile where clocks quit, a rumor about CBs that go quiet not because nobody's talking but because time is chewing with its mouth closed. A pickup eased past, slowed like it might pull in, then thought better of it, and moved on, and that tiny act of avoidance made the air feel fragile, like two strangers on a sidewalk pretending not to notice a man talking to himself too loudly. And at that precise moment, my phone buzzed with a lost signal ping, then corrected to a different tower with a timestamp I couldn't reconcile. I've never been a superstitious man. Dispatch doesn't accept "the highway was haunted" as a reason for missing a delivery window, and bills don't respect metaphors, but they're in the gravel, holding a watch that told me to drop it. Surrounded by enough metal to weigh down a dozen pockets, I felt a shift inside my sternum, like the notch before a seatbelt locks in a sudden stop. I turned to go, took 3 steps, and the world did the smallest wrong thing. The shadow of my rig moved as if the sun had jumped, except there was no sun, just moon and stars. And shadows don't behave like that at night unless something larger than weather slides across them. And the hair on my neck did a trick I didn't know it had. The dash clock, visible through the windshield, clicked from 3:10 to 3:08, and the engine note dipped a hair and came back. And I found myself counting my breaths like I used to as a kid to keep the night from expanding into the closet. And then a voice I recognized as my own said, from nowhere close enough to be cruel, "Leave it," in the exact inflection I'd use if I'd caught my hand reaching for a stovetop. I don't talk to myself out loud. The cab is loud enough. The CB has enough personalities without adding another, and yet I heard it. And it came from a direction that made geometry unhelpful, above and behind and also inside the cartilage curve of my right ear. And the childish part of me that still lives inside the responsible adult did as it was told. Back in the seat, truck in gear, shoulder checked twice. I eased back onto 191 with a care I usually reserve for ice, and the watch lay in the gravel like a small obedient animal I'd ordered to stay. And the clock on the dash slid forward to 3:11 and for the first time in 15 minutes stayed there like a professional. I made Winslow by daybreak, the sky lifting in layers, relief leveling out into that post-incident cheap calm, and over pancakes that tasted like permission to keep living. I asked the waitress if she'd ever heard of folks dumping watches on 191 like it was a tradition, and she didn't laugh, which was worse than laughing. She said, "People leave all kinds of things out there, some because they're spooked and some because they want to spook others." And then she said a thing that stuck in me like a burr. Sometimes the desert wants you to mark where you were saved. Saved is a big word. It implies an intention to harm that was averted, as if the highway itself woke up hungry and changed its mind. And I don't know if that's true, or if I just walked into a pocket of bad signal and worse psychology. But when I rolled back by 251 a week later, in full daylight, the pullout glittered with more metal than before, not less. And I didn't stop, because repetition is how rituals form, and I wasn't interested in joining a club I didn't understand. There's a practical explanation for this kind of rumor. If a local tow outfit had a bad wreck there once, and the story spread, drivers might start paying more attention there, and attention saves lives. If you tell a man the clock jumps, he might slow down just in case, and slowing down is its own small religion out here, where speed is how you pay the rent, and also how you can get yourself erased. But there's also the explanation that doesn't explain as much as it offers a shape to fear. Long miles, with not enough sleep then, you out until suggestions slip through easier, and the desert isn't shy about suggesting you participate in its theater. Sleep debt is a known hallucinogen, and the line between a nudge from your better judgment and a voice that thinks it belongs to you is thinner than you want to admit. On a later run, I mentioned 251 on the radio the way you mention a restaurant without endorsing it, and 3 drivers came back with their own versions, a dashcam file that corrupted exactly at 3:08, a wristwatch that refused to pass that minute for a full hour before giving up and dying, a GPS breadcrumb that drew a loop on the map when the truck hadn't looped, and those can all be coincidence until you're the one pulling into gravel and deciding whether to add your small metal to the pile. I never picked up another watch out there, and I never left one either. I adjusted my speed. I checked my clocks against the sky. I let the rig talk to me through the wheel the way old trucks do when you stop trying to bully them into obedience. And if the minute hand hiccuped, I pretended not to see. The way you treat a person you love, who clears their throat to cover a crack in their voice. Maybe the desert stole my time and gave it back the way gamblers slide chips across felt to keep you seated. Maybe my own tired brain needed a story and built one out of numbers and reflective trash, a private myth to make attention feel holy. Either way, when I pass 2:51 now, the urge to check the clock arrives like a reflex, and I do. And I don't mind the way my pulse lags a beat behind the minute, because some places teach you to notice yourself arriving. The map said County Road, a harmless gray vein that stitched desert scrub to a service town, whose name slid off the tongue like gravel. And dispatch said it shaved 40 minutes off my run if I took it before. The monsoon built its evening spine of thunderheads, and the sky said nothing, which is how skies talk before they mean it. I turned off the main highway in late afternoon, with that fool's optimism you only get when an app draws a straight line, where the world has never had the courtesy to be straight, and the first 10 miles rewarded me with empty sun and a wind that smelled like iron. The kind you only notice if you grew up downwind of rail yards or rain. Old fence posts marched the length of it, silvered wood leaning like tired men, and the land spread out on both sides as if someone had ironed it for a photograph, dirt the color of rust ground into powder by 1,000 summers. Mesquite hunkered in low patience, and where the earth rose, it did so without drama, gentle, like a breath through the ribs. Then the edge appeared on the far horizon like a bruise blooming, mid-air, brown, climbing, rolling, one of those moving walls that make you think of ocean even if you've never been near one. And my gut made a small decision. My brain caught up to 10 seconds later. Get off the open. Haboob is a word people say with a shrug in Phoenix, until a brown skyline taller than your faith eats the city whole. And out here, without buildings or billboards to catch it, the dust doesn't arrive so much as it erases, and the first brush of it walked across the hood like fine sand poured by a mean child. Invisibility went from miles to blocks, to a room you could cross in 3 steps. The trick is simple in theory. Off the road, lights off, foot off brake, wait it out. But theory doesn't account for how fast a storm can turn a 2-lane into a funnel where panic drives blind and straight until it meets you. So I eased the rig into a shallow pullout, where the gravel felt like a promise, and killed everything that glowed. The wind hit then, a cabinet slam of air that rocked 80,000 pounds like a toy, dust seeping through every tiny kindness the manufacturer left in the cab. It had texture, dust does, a taste like old pennies and sun-baked plywood. And in the stale, coppery dark, I sat very still and listened to my own heartbeat because it was the only proof the truck hadn't floated. If this is where it ended, it would be a safety lecture. An anecdote about patience, a nod to the advice printed on state websites in bold letters, with periods between each word as if a stern parent is speaking. But storms don't always come alone, and when you are pinned in place, you notice the other things that live in the margins, the older weather, the settling histories. The first knock came soft, like the back of a fingernail, somewhere along the sleeper wall. Not enough to be heard over the wind, if the wind weren't the kind that pulses, giving you tiny windows to listen through. I told myself it was pebbles lifted and flung, 1,000 small projectiles learning to fly for the first time and choosing my metal as classroom. Then a second knock, same spot, same gentle insistence, and a third that slid sideways, a few inches like someone adjusting for an angle. And the kind of cold that ignores temperature moved in, the ancestral kind that says doorways should be defended and names should not be given. I crawled into the sleeper on knees, a ridiculous motion in that moment because movement makes you sound like prey, and pressed my palm to the wall. The surface vibrated with wind and with something else that came and went in a rhythm that didn't care about gusts, and I realized I was aligning my breath to it. A small surrender I resented as soon as I caught it. The dust outside built into a solidity that made the world look like frosted glass from an inch away. And in that smeared small universe, another sound joined the storm. A hiss and clatter of something dragging along the ground, low, heavy. A weight like a covered trough or a metal gate pulled by one stubborn person, intermittent, as if momentum were negotiated and then lost. I told myself everything polite I could think of: cows, fence wire, a busted sheet of tin gone wandering, but each explanation dissolved on contact with the next knock, the next drag, and a new noise, like bones poured into a bucket and shaken once. A single, decisive rattle that came from under the frame. People like to tell you Arizona's strangest histories belong to carny towns and outlaws and certain bridges that ate their sheriffs, but the dirt has its own ledger, older and quieter, and storms pay their debts in exhumations, in little reminders that a flat place used to be a deeper place, and that men have always hidden things in the earth when the law or their conscience grew inconvenient. The cab grew hotter, though I had the vents shut. Dust is an insulator when it wants to be, and sweat gathered at my ears, trickled down my neck in lines that strobed, when lightning, a rare dry kind, popped somewhere to the south, a flash that turned the brown outside white for a knife slice of time. And in that alchemy, I saw movement where the passenger mirror should have been reflection. A figure leaned there, not against the door but near it, braced like a man learning the stance he will need to open a thing that does not want to cooperate. Head wrapped in cloth, goggles dark, a silhouette assembled by storm, and the rational part of me proposed a rescuer, or a trooper, or a rancher whose cows had gone ambitious. The part of me that has counted too many late-night cash drawers defended by lonely managers suggested other categories. The knocks came again, 3 in a row, aimed and patient, and a voice tried itself against the weather. It failed, came back, failed again, then slipped in during a lull. "You in there?" A statement, not a question, and I hate how much that form implies ownership. I didn't answer because words make threads in storms, and threads can be followed. I reached instead for the short iron bar I keep because you never know when a pin will jam, and because steel is an old language everyone understands, and I sat there with my hand wrapped around it and waited for the next move as dust found its way under my collar and into the part of my mind that catalogs regrets. The handle tested itself. One careful press, another. And in that mechanical intimacy, I remembered all at once that old service story from the Route 66 years, the one about the couple who ran a roadside menagerie at a place called Two Guns. How greed and bad decisions, and a canyon with a name you don't put on a wedding invitation, turned their enterprise into a set of ruins. It's a tourist stop now for people who like their history with angles and their photos with decay. The door didn't move. Modern cabs will forgive many sins, but they do not forgive unlocked doors in storms if you've learned even once that rule. And my learning had stuck, thank God for small humiliations that later look like wisdom. And the figure outside went still, the kind of stillness men do when they are counting to calm themselves or change plans. Another lightning blink, another white room, and in that slice the figure had a shape that didn't read quite right. Legs too far apart, torso slight, shoulders high from pulling or habit. And a second figure now behind the first, lower, moving the way a person moves who does not wish to add his footfalls to the record. Storms bring company. That is their oldest trick. They give cover to the desperate and the cruel, and the desert forgives both because it forgives nothing. It simply erases distinctions until everyone is the same shade of dirty. The second figure crouched, hands to the undercarriage, and the rattle came again, closer, purposeful. It is one thing to be in danger. It is another to feel your home invaded, and your cab is your home on long runs, a space you lay your head and your secrets and your sandwiches. And a hand under your bed is a primal grievance, and I found myself speaking before I had composed anything worth saying. State police are en route. which was universally true in a cosmic sense, but not in any way that might be useful. The figures didn't run. They paused, and the first one tilted his head like a dog told to wait. Then the wind threw a handful of gravel against the door with such malice that I jumped. And in that jump, my hip bumped the air horn toggle and gave the desert a blast that could wake whatever had slept there since the last time somebody needed waking. Silence is not possible in a hay boob, but there are degrees. And the 6 seconds after the horn stretched out thin and weird, a pocket of attention in which the storm seemed to tilt its head too. And then there was motion under the chassis, like someone backing out fast. A scuffle, a cough ingested by dust, and the figures pulled away without drama, as if offended by a breach of etiquette. I didn't move until the brown outside lightened to tan, and the tan hinted at blue somewhere not invested in my survival, and the wind stepped down a gear, and the world's outlines returned, as if drawn by a lazy hand. And when I opened the door, the cab filled with a last sullen gust that left grit against my molars and little dunes on the rubber mats. Under the frame, by the step, a coil of heavy gauge wire lay like a dead snake, cut clean at one end with a pair of bite marks at the other, where someone had tried brute force before choosing intelligence, and zip ties dangled snapped, 3 of them, evidence of intention and a willingness to improvise in the absence of a plan. They hadn't had time to finish whatever joke they had written for me, whether it was to hamper steering or to make a later stop more interesting. And if you want a moral, it is this: weather and men make their own economies. And sometimes the currency they trade in is your attention, which is finite and worth more than any diesel you'll buy this year. Back on the main highway, after the storm's back had broken and the shoulders were strewn with tumbleweeds that hadn't been there an hour before, I passed a DPS cruiser heading east, lights off, steady, a man inside with the kind of posture that says he has a list to work through, and I wanted to flag him, to say words like attempted and tampering, and the name storms can't erase. But the road was moving by then, and the story was already choosing how it would live inside me. At the next truck stop, men spoke in the grammar of aftermath. Did you get caught in that wall? Did you see the sky go brown? Did you pull aside like the signs say? Did you hear about the pileup westbound? And I let their sentences circle, then offered only this: avoid the short gray line on the map when the horizon bruises, because the storm will come with everything in it, and not all of it will be wind. By the time the blue light found me on the Black Canyon grade, I'd already told myself I was done believing in anything that didn't come with a bill of lading or a DOT number, because belief gets you sloppy out here, and sloppy gets you across by the shoulder with plastic flowers that fade faster than the guilt of the driver who put them there. I was northbound out of Phoenix, climbing toward Sunset Point with a reefer that hummed like a tame storm and a schedule tight enough to sing. The night clear and dry, the kind of desert plenty that lets you pretend the world is simple if you keep the engine in the green and your eyes in the mirrors. And traffic was thin, only a handful of taillights stringing the grade like low stars. They'd put in new signs along this stretch, a constellation of digital nags that flash your speed and your sins, because people take the downhill too hot, and physics writes its own press releases, and the glow off those boards feels like supervision, like somebody's paying attention, which is comforting until it isn't. The first time I saw the blue, it was far back in the mirror, a bead of color, no siren claims, not police, not tow, not anything official, just a soft electric coin pulsing at a rhythm that didn't match any strobe I've ever been pulled over by, and it sat back there for a mile as if getting its breathing right. Blue light is a liar. It suggests ice, clean, technology, hospital scrubs, safety. Out here, where the desert keeps its own ledger, blue means something that doesn't have to earn your trust because it can simply arrive. And the first time it stepped closer, it did so without headlights, without a vehicle, just a color in the darkness growing from pearl to bruise. I radio checked out of habit, called out mile marker and a query if anyone else had eyes on a stray blue, and the band gave me that listening silence truckers use when they don't want to be first with the weird thing. And in that pocket of no replies, I realized the reefer hum had merged with a faint electric whine like the sound tubes make when a TV comes to life, a sound my childhood remembers, even if my dashboard doesn't. There are plenty of rational explanations for lights on I-17 at night. Construction crews, ADOT convoys, work trucks tucked into the gore taking a nap they shouldn't. But this wasn't on the shoulder. It was tracking the lane, held at my 9 o'clock, riding the guardrail like a second thought that refused to leave. And when I took my foot off the throttle to see if it would overshoot, it matched, gentle as a dance partner. The grade steepens near Bumblebee, and you feel the trailer in your bones there, a tug through the fifth wheel like a memory of all the bad decisions you've ever kept upright. So I focused on the hands and the wheel and the next white line, and the blue tucked in closer until the cab filled with a wash of color, like light through a swimming pool. Wavering, washing the dash, turning my hands aquatic and strange. Sleep deprivation plays tricks. Anyone who drives nights for a living can give you a catalog of false shapes and suggestive shadows. But the reefer's temp readout went from its steady 34 to a blank scoreboard for a beat, and then came back. And the radio thumped once with a sound like air being punched out of a paper bag, and my speed display on the grade sign ahead flickered nonsense at me, 68, 12, 45, before correcting as if embarrassed. When the blue finally entered the cab, it didn't do so with drama. It simply dropped the pretense of glass and settled around me like fog that had gone to college, a soft saturation. And with it came a feeling that is shameful to describe because it sounds like science fiction. A pressure like hands on either side of my head, not squeezing, not painful, but orienting. Like a barber aligning you to the mirror before the first cut. And then the memories began to play, not images. Not like a reel, but as textures and temperatures. The plastic of my first CB mic, the way the cord tasted when I chewed it while bored at 22. The cold of the aluminum ladder at my grandfather's place in Flagstaff, and the child logic that convinced me I could see California from the top. The width of my daughter's hand the day she was born, too small for any glove the world sells. The smell, God help me, of antifreeze the week I almost quit and didn't. There is a part of you that watches even when you're being watched. A witness inside the self. And that part took notes, while another part wanted to cry from the simple intimacy of being known without permission. And the rig kept its line, like muscle memory does when the mind is busy, and I realized I was not steering so much as being steered, eased, guided through the downhill curve, as if a driving instructor sat ghostwise over my shoulders. Not funny, I said out loud, because indignation is a thread you can pull when you feel very small. And my voice sounded wrong in the colored air, pitched younger, like the cabin had taken the tone from one of those old memories and applied it forward. And I hated that detail more than the light because it meant this thing wasn't just replaying. It was editing. People will tell you about orbs in Arizona, about red that goes blue, about sky fires over Havasu, about snowflake and banners flapping in the culture wars. And it's easy to laugh because the desert has endless room for people to store their certainty. But this wasn't above me. It was in my lungs, and it was listening. And when it pushed, it did so not at the wheel but at my attention. At Coldwater, the speed feedback sign lit up with a bright too fast, and then blinked to slow down, and then dimmed to black, like someone had pulled the plug. And in the black, the blue grew brighter, compensating, and my peripheral vision filled with a wash of faces that were almost mine, cheekbones off by a degree, haircuts from other years, a catalog of selves I had nearly become. There was no voice, not in the way the CB had given me on that other night, but there was a sense like a question being asked without words. This one, this one, this one, as if it were sorting me, as if the desert's ledger had gone digital, and I was an entry being reconciled, and the panic that came was clean and childlike. Don't take, don't take, don't take. And my right foot twitched for the brake like a dog dreaming. I eased onto the shoulder at a wide gravel pullout, hazards on, engine at idle, hands flat on my knees because I needed to feel their weight. And the blue held, dimmer now, concentrated to a soft sphere the size of a melon floating a foot off the steering wheel. And every sensible part of me cataloged gas leaks, LED failures, reflections, prank drones, all the universe of plausible, while the rest of me stared like a man who has found a door in a wall where no architect left one. 5 seconds, 10, 20. The blue pulsed a little faster, and with each pulse the sensation of being red intensified. Not mind red, not thoughts, but the body's diary, where the knee aches in rain, where the shoulder never healed right after the chain binder slipped, where the old scar across the brow tightens in winter. It was a scan, the word unavoidable and ridiculous. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. Not zipped, not fled, just absent, like someone took their hand off a lamp. The cab went back to the color the world sells, and the reefer readout held steady, and the digital sign up the grade flashed its sermon for the next sinner. And when I exhaled, it sounded too loud, like I'd been holding breath so long, my body forgot polite volumes. A minute later, a DPS unit sailed by southbound, no lights, on patrol, steady. And for a foolish instant I considered flagging him, telling him that something had sorted me like laundry, and decided I was clean enough to keep. And then I pictured the report, and the look, and the polite referral to a hotline that would invite me to rest more, and believe less. At Sunset Point, I pulled in, killed the engine, and sat with my hands still again, watching other men do the ordinary. Stretch, piss, check straps, scroll their phones like the glass knows the route better than they do. And the comfort of that mundanity nearly undid me. The world had gone back to normal, as if nothing had put its face inside mine, and asked if I was arranged correctly. A tourist kid pointed north and told his mother the stars were moving, that one of them was blue and fast, and she shushed him because the bathroom line was long, and the world requires you to keep commitments even when the sky is having a conversation with your child. And I envied that shush with a bitterness I'm not proud of. On the climb to Cordis Junction, the CB crackled with a voice that told a different story. A driver, swearing about a drone with a cop light harassing him, promising to swat it out of the air at the next stop, a man with more confidence than equipment, and 2 others chimed in with laughter that performed courage while hoping privately for luck. By Camp Verde, the blue didn't return, and the relief was real enough to taste, metallic and thin. But something else had been left behind, the way the smell of a guest lingers after they're gone, and I realized my memories felt handled, not damaged, not stolen, but touched, aligned, as if the boxes had been straightened on the shelf and labels corrected to a taxonomy I didn't approve. Weeks later, at a fuel island near Cordes, a mechanic with old grease on his knuckles told a story without knowing he was telling mine. He'd had customers complain about sign interference around the new systems. Said the speed feedback boards threw weird returns at certain angles. Said sometimes the onboard electronics hiccup like they're catching a cold from the hillside. And I nodded, because rationality is a warm coat in winter, even if it doesn't fit quite right. There's a rumor that the canyon country keeps lights like pets, miners' ghosts, highway mirages, St. Elmo's far from any mast, and that they pick a person now and then to remind him he's more cataloged than king, and if you drive long enough, you collect these rumors like bugs on a windshield, wipe them off at the next stop, pretend you didn't see the wings. What makes this different is the intimacy. A thing that could have frightened me with spectacle chose to frighten me with attention, and that is harder to shrug off because fear of spectacle fades when the sun comes up. Fear of surveillance teaches you to duck when nobody's looking, to second-guess your recollections, to mistrust the smoothness of your own narrative. A month after, on a southbound at 2 a.m., alone on the grade, I caught a blue whisper in the mirror and felt my heartbeat step into a faster cadence. And I did the strangest thing. I turned the radio up to drown the quiet, because quiet is where the question fits. and I filled the cab with a weather report from a place I wasn't. A voice so boring it could only be true. And the light didn't come closer, and I didn't slow down, and the world behaved like a machine again. If there's a lesson, it isn't about aliens or angels or electricity searching your ribs. It's about how easily the road can file you, how the desert will audit your life with whatever tools it finds. Wind, men, blue lights, old radios, and how the only defense you have that isn't made of superstition is attention and the stubborn insistence that you are not a document to be edited by strangers. So when someone asks about Black Canyon and the rumors, I don't talk about the thing that knew my knee and my daughter's hand. I talk about the grade, the signs that flash your speed, the way the downhill will eat. You, if you let your belief outrun your brakes, and how lights on that stretch, of any color, means somebody wants you to look away from the one instrument that keeps you honest. She stood where the asphalt narrows to a throat before Canyon Diablo, thumb down, not out. A gesture that said, I don't need a ride, I need a witness. And the responsible part of me that counts hours and miles told the rest of me to keep rolling, because nothing good starts with a figure on a shoulder near midnight on a road that used to be Route 66 and still remembers how to take things. I had the cab warm, the radio low, and a delivery window that didn't love surprises, but nights have their own economies, and some debts don't take cash. So I eased onto the rumble strip and stopped 2 lengths past her. Engine ticking, hazards winking red in the canyon's black, as if I were apologizing to the dark for bringing color into it. She came up to the passenger side with a steadiness that didn't match the cold, coat too light, hair bound back in a way that looked more practical than vain, and carried under one arm a book that took the light strange, like it remembered fire. When she climbed in, she put it on her lap the way people put Bibles when they still expect them to perform. "West," she said, voice like a motel hallway at 3 a.m., and I nodded because west was where I was going anyway, and because a person who offers a single syllable like that isn't starting a conversation so much as testing if you'll keep one, and the cab settled into a new equilibrium, the way the air changes when a second heartbeat enters a room. The book was a Bible, half burned along one long edge, as if someone had tried to erase it with heat and quit halfway through, and there were paper scraps inside, tucked like receipts, ash-smudged and stiff, and every time the reefer hit a bump and the cab shivered, a little soot would lift and hang in the dome light like exhausted moths. People tell stories about Canyon Diablo because the place invites them. A town once meaner than Tombstone, with a street named Hell, and a habit of burying men where they fell when time ran out on finding a preacher. And later, Two Guns with its cave of dead Apaches, and its showman who sold grief as entertainment to travelers in hats and optimism. The land keeps those stories hot for longer than you'd think, like a skillet left on a pilot flame. We rolled past the old exit that still reads, Two Guns, if you know what to look for, and she watched it go like a person watches a house they've already moved out of, certain of the furniture they left, and unsure about the ghosts. And when we crossed the steel over the canyon, she pressed the burned book harder to her, and I felt a ridiculous urge to slow down on a bridge that doesn't respond to tenderness. "You believe in curses?" she asked, not curious, not coy, just administrative. And the sensible answer, "No," sat on my tongue like a coin I didn't spend, because belief is a luxury on the road, and also a hazard. Drivers who believe in too much forget to believe in stopping distances and angles, and drivers who believe in nothing eventually meet something patient. "I believe in places," I said, which is what passes for religion when you drive long enough. And she nodded like a clerk checking a box, and opened the book to the center, where the fire had eaten the margins and left the spine charred, and slid out a folded page that wasn't Bible paper at all but copier stock. Gray lines of type I recognized with the same deep insult you feel when you see your face reflected in a window and don't like who it belongs to. It was my life, or a version of it, in a neat column of details that felt invasive and perfect. Jobs I'd quit, jobs that had quit me, The year I promised I was done and wasn't. The day my father asked me to forgive him with his eyes, and I pretended to be busy with a cup of hospital water. The name of a girl I haven't thought about in 15 years. Because if you leave certain doors shut, the house holds together. She hadn't written it, but someone had, and the burn across the top had spared only the title, Account. "This yours?" she asked, which is what a surgeon might say holding up the tumor. And I said no, because pride is stupid and strong, and she let the lie go by the way you let a bug pass without killing it, noting its species for later. Canyon Diablo fell away behind us, a slash of dark where the land argues with itself, and the interstate smoothed out into something that pretends to be predictable. And she unfolded another scrap with the same careful fingertips you use for a baby bird or a grenade. This one was a page from Psalms, edges burnt into a scallop, center untouched, and someone had underlined in pencil the sentence about walking through the valley, which felt like a joke the place had written to keep itself entertained. "Who gave you that?" I asked, and she smiled a little. A crack in a cold surface, not warm, but humane, and said, "A man who never left." And I didn't need more geography than that because Arizona is full of men who have never left their first bad decision. The question was whether she meant the bridge, the town, the cave, or the moment a life turns into a ledger. She didn't ask about me, didn't use the usual tools. Where you headed? You from around here, you got kids, you got regrets. And the lack of those little social mirrors made me feel exposed in a way talking never does. Conversation is camouflage. And this was the opposite. A silence that made inventory of us both. At Winslow, she asked me to take the business loop, not like a command, but like a weather report, and we rolled past dark storefronts that looked embarrassed about their shutters, and a diner with an open sign because some small towns still believe in insomniacs. And she watched nothing in particular, as if the point of seeing was to be seen doing it by something older. "Why the Bible?" I asked, because the book's burned edge and its incongruity in a midnight cab had become a character in the ride, and she said, "Because some words don't burn how you want," which is either superstition or experience or both, and she lifted it a little so the dome could read it. And for the first time I noticed the leather had a stamped name on the cover, not hers, not mine, but a man's I recognized from a news story years back about a shootout nobody solved because it had been conducted by people who specialize in getting solved wrong. She traced the name with a fingernail and said, "He left this where I could find it." And that pronoun had too much weight for a casual encounter. It implied a before and an after and a chore, and I realized something uncomfortable and stupid. I wanted to help, and helping strangers on the shoulder near towns with hell streets is how men become anecdotes. She asked me to drop her at an exit with no lights, a place where the interstate gives up pretending to be generous, and the frontage road takes over the task of getting you to the middle of nowhere. And when I signaled and took it, the gravel felt like a decision that would look bad in writing later, and yet the cab relaxed, as if we were finally following the route we'd been on the whole time. "There," she said, pointing at a cut in the fence that had the courtesy to advertise itself with a sagging wire. And I stopped, with the nose pointed at a field of dark like a blank page, and she gathered the book, the pages, the ash, and opened the door without looking back, then paused with one foot on the step like a person deciding whether a last sentence is warranted. "He's going to crash," she said, not melodramatic, not frenzied like a line item, like a weather warning, and then added my name in a tone that made the cab colder. And before I could unpack the grammar, who he was, where, when, why tell me, she was out in the dark and gone the way certain animals move when they've learned the lay of a place by living, not by maps. I sat there idiot still, watching nothing. And then the CB coughed alive with breathless swearing, a driver I didn't know, mile marker west of us by 3, reporting a rollover in the median. No other cars, trailer on its side like a tired elephant, driver out and walking, thank God. The timbre of his voice was that cracking mix of adrenaline and relief you hear at births and crashes and back doors finally closing. I pulled back on, crept the shoulder, scanned, found the wreck where the man said hazards popping, and saw a figure waving his arms with that uncoordinated vigor that means shock rather than signal. And I rolled my window and shouted that help was coming, and he shouted back a word that sounded like a name that matched the stamp on the Bible's cover, the one she'd traced while telling me about words that don't burn right. He wasn't bleeding, not in ways he could see, but that means very little in a night where momentum has just written a new paragraph for your bones. And as he sat on the guardrail and checked his phone and then looked at it like it had betrayed him by having no bars, he said, "She told me not to take this ramp." And I didn't ask who, because there are kinds of sanity that are impolite to interrupt. The cruiser and the wrecker came, professional and bored, uniforms that know how to be kind without leaving fingerprints on your memory. And I gave a statement that was practical and false by omission because the truth had too many pronouns, and the nouns didn't want my help. And when the flashers painted the scrub red, blue, the canyon country looked like it had put on party lights for a wake. By dawn, I was in Flagstaff with coffee that tasted like a second chance, and a sun that pretended the night hadn't had its way with us. And I parked and slept and dreamed of paper that wouldn't burn, and names that fit on covers, and women who step out of fields, as if the earth needs to keep accounts with witnesses. And when I woke, I told myself a sensible story. She was a person with a book and a past. I was a person with a seat and a wheel. A crash happened because crashes do, and coincidence is the religion of the tired. And yet, every time I pass the Two Guns exit now, I check the shoulder without wanting to, and I feel for the weight of something that isn't in my cab, and I listen for a voice that will ask me administrative questions about belief. And sometimes I think I see a figure in the mirror where the asphalt narrows, thumb down, nod out, saying, not that she needs a ride, but that she will be there whether I stop or not, because some routes are haunted not by the dead, but by the debts the living carry between towns that forgot how to keep their own books. Grief is a private road until the desert makes it public, and on a February night west of Holbrook, the sky was so clean it felt like it would ring if tapped. And the CB was off because the noise hurts when you're already cracked, and the reefer hummed like something alive that doesn't mind your silence. Her lullaby arrived the way weather does out here, first as suggestion, then as a fact you can taste. Threaded through the static of a channel I hadn't keyed, the simple tune she used to hum against my shoulder when the world was only as large as a nursery, and the worst thing that could happen was a dropped bottle. The human brain is a forgiving editor. It lets you believe the easy version until the harder one insists, and the easy version was highway hypnosis, a mind slipping sideways after too many miles and too little sleep, an old song recalled by a bump or a smell or a rhythm in the tires. So I cracked the window and let the high desert cold lift the hairs along my arm like a check-in, present, awake, here. But the melody didn't fade with air or reason. It strengthened, and with it came the faintest whisper of her voice, trying out consonants that wobble toddlers have when sound is new and brave. And the CB's orange dial, slick with age, looked suddenly like a relic I'd brought into a temple against the rules. 7 months earlier, what took her life arrived from the side at an intersection with no reputation, as banal as a sentence that ends without a period, and every mile since had been a negotiation with a world that refused to stop being itself just because mine had ended. And there, in that cab, the lullaby turned the negotiation into a courtroom. I told myself to turn the radio on, to force the encounter into something measurable, to catch it in circuitry the way you trap a fly under a glass. And when the speaker popped and hissed and settled, the music was clearer, as if the air preferred a system, and then her voice spoke my name in the exact mistaken cadence she used when she was 3, and the R bent wrong, and the I stretched, and the desert went very still in the way it does before. It decides whether to forgive you. "Baby," I said, which is a word that fits poorly in a trucker's mouth, but belongs to me in a way no other word does. And the reply that came wasn't hers. Not exactly. The tone matched. The breath did not. The rhythm was a hair off, like a recording played on a machine that stutters. And grief, canny animal, stood up inside me and bared its teeth. Someone will tell you this is what the mind does under deprivation, that after a day and a half awake, the brain begins to project its own theater onto the windshield, that voices and faces arrive as naturally as thirst. And they're not wrong. It's written in studies, and suits, and insurance adjusters as cross-exams. And yet knowledge does not make a hallway shorter when a light goes out halfway down. "Daddy, why'd you leave me?" the voice asked. And the words were mine in another mouth, my own question thrown back at me from every morning. She wasn't there to buckle into a booster. And shame is a hot, precise instrument that can work blindfolded. It cut in lines I had already traced with a therapist and a judge and a bottle in a pantry I don't keep anymore. "I didn't," I said to the radio, to the empty seat, to the reflection of my face in the passenger window that looked older than the last time I'd checked. And the rig held the line as if the wheel had grown a keel and the desert were a sea that tolerated liars as long as they drove well. On Channel 19, a voice in the middle distance asked if anyone was catching interference around the painted desert, a practical question in a weirdly tender tone, and the lullaby thinned, respectful, as if it belonged to etiquette I didn't understand. And when the band went quiet again, the song returned with the soft insistence of a child at a door. I turned the CB off, and the music stayed. I unplugged the mic, and the music stayed. I killed the head unit, and the music stayed softer now. Not in the air, but in the walls, in the wire, in the name of every part that could vibrate, if asked by something that knew the right pitch. And there's only so much rational dismantling a person can do before they admit the limits of screws. At a wide shoulder near a service road, I pulled off and sat with the engine running because the sound of a motor is a spell that keeps a man from thinking too many ancient thoughts. And the lullaby wove itself around the idol like ivy finding brick. And something in me understood, finally, what the message wanted. Not a haunting, not a reunion, but a question shaped like a child, and asked in a voice I would be forced to answer. "Why'd you leave me?" It asked again, and the fair answer is ugly. A marriage that broke along old fault lines nobody bothered to map. A court that saw hours as currency and spent mine on work, that paid rent and bought shoes and left holes anyway. An accident that didn't need permission to end the argument. And none of that converts to a sentence a child could carry without breaking. So I gave it the only truth that isn't fact. I didn't know how to stay and be a person. And the cab changed temperature by a degree the way rooms do when someone stops crying without agreeing to stop. And the music shifted to the part of the lullaby where the melody turns downward, a slide into peace, and part of me wanted to let it finish and earn whatever sleep was hiding in the space after the last note. Then the other voice came, not hers, not mine, but close enough to both to make me furious. It was my ex-wife's cadence in my mouth. It was my own jokes told like accusations. It was my father's sigh laid over my daughter's question, and the word it chose was the meanest, selfish. A label that sticks to grief like burrs and grows heavier each mile you carry it. Anger is easier than sorrow. It has a clarity grief refuses, so I let it flare. And with that heat came a recollection as firm as a road sign. The day a winter whiteout outside Winslow turned the interstate into a graveyard of hazard lights, and I sat for 6 hours without moving, talking to her on video about snow monsters that eat tires. Her giggle loud enough to make the man in the next rig smile at his own loneliness. And if a voice wants to audit my failures, it should also tally my attempts at gentleness. The lullaby softened to almost nothing, as if conceding a point. And I remembered what old-timers say about radios acting like Ouija boards when the ionosphere kinks, about voices bouncing off layers of sky and returning with miles on them, about hearing things meant for other cabs, other lives, and how grief uses any speaker you offer to ask its one question in as many disguises as you'll tolerate. A knock came at the driver's door, a real one, knuckles on metal, and the shock of a human body existing 3 feet from your isolation is electrifying. A face peered up, a trooper's hat, and a trooper's expression that mixes boredom with concern, so you don't do anything interesting. And he asked if I was broke down, or just catching my breath. And the normalcy of his voice rearranged the air. "Catching my breath," I said. And it wasn't untrue, and he nodded like a man who understands there are kinds of breakdowns he cannot ticket and cannot fix, and he told me to be safe, and to keep it between the lines. And the desert relaxed a fraction, as if the presence of paperwork nearby had scared the older questions back under the seat. When he pulled away, I turned the radio back on, not for company, but as a boundary. And the lullaby did not return. Though, if I turned the volume down low enough, I could pretend I heard a thread of it in the hiss, the way you can pretend a dead person's smell remains in a shirt if you're willing to be foolish for a minute in the service of relief. I made Flagstaff by dawn and found a church parking lot open to the sky, and I sat under a cross I don't attend and spoke aloud to a girl who does not answer, told her about elk prints and a dusting of snow by the way station, about a trucker at the next pump who wore a Santa hat unseasonably and without irony, about the way the cold makes the diesel smell cleaner, and saying her name out loud felt like proof I hadn't left, at least for that hour. Later, a dispatcher who doesn't know me well asked about the long stop in my logs, and I said weather in a tone that ends follow-ups, and he accepted it because he had 6 other fires, and none of them involved my particular brand of honesty, and that is the gift and the cruelty of this work. Your inner life remains yours, even when it's busy rearranging the furniture while you drive. Weeks passed. The road did what roads do, demanded, paid, forgot. And sometimes in the engine noise I heard a phrase begin, and sometimes at night in a cheap motel with a loud heater, I woke to a hum that was only plumbing and also a lullaby, and the choice each time was whether to answer. An answer means you're willing to say what can't be fixed and drive anyway. If someone asks what the strangest thing the CB ever did to me was, I won't tell this story. I will talk about skip conditions and odd harmonics and voices bleeding through from a hurricane 3 states away, because those are sentences that leave your listener intact. This one doesn't, because it suggests the desert is not empty and your cab is not as private as you need it to be when memory wants to talk. So here is what can be said plainly. Grief will find a channel, and the road offers many, and sometimes the most merciful thing a man can do is turn the volume down and sing the rest of the song himself, quietly, until the part where the melody dips and the child falls asleep, and then keep driving. Not because the destination matters, but because motion is the only prayer some of us remember how to say without lying. The first time the loop caught me, it didn't feel like a haunting so much as a clerical error the night refused to correct. East of Sierra Vista, on a county spur that should have fed me clean back to I-10, the GPS went polite and vague. At the exact moment the sky tipped from purple to black, and the desert flattened into that military kind of emptiness where everything looks issued. The road numbers had been good all evening, white on green with confidence, and then for 20 minutes they stopped existing and left me with a 2-lane that kept repeating the same quarter mile, like a chorus the song didn't want to leave. The first tell was the billboard for a roofing company with the same misspelled word. Guarantee without the second E, followed by the same cattle guard clack, then the roadside shrine with a crown of faded silk sunflowers, and finally the cinder block pump house with a turquoise door whose paint had blushed to chalk. On most nights, you don't count details like that. On a loop night, you inventory everything because proof is how you don't go crazy out here where the horizon never moves. It should have been an easy fix. Turn around. Add 10 minutes, catch the larger road with the smaller brain. Except the U-turn put me back on the same stretch going the other way, a mirror that didn't feel backward so much as reissued, and the pump house still sat on the right, and the shrine still arrived on the left, and the billboard tried the same grammatical sin on me, with a friendliness that felt cruel. The phone thought I was progressing just fine. Tiny arrow inching toward a junction the world refused to provide, and the dash clock started doing that petty cash nonsense clocks do when they're sure you'll forgive them. Drifting a minute, correcting it, offering the same time like a dog dropping the same stick. 11:42, 11:42, 11:42. On nights like this, you keep a tighter grip than you need on the wheel to feel something that obeys your hands. You check mirrors more than traffic requires, looking for a difference that will absolve you of what you already suspect. When the coyote crossed the lane at the exact same joint in the asphalt, head down, not looking at me, I said no, out loud, the way you talk to a slot machine that wants to keep your dollar. What breaks a loop isn't power or prayer, it's disrespect. You stop participating in the pattern. So after the third pass, I put the rig into a slow roll and did all the things you don't do in a neat line. Cut the radio, blacked the dash, coasted under idle, and stared into the roadside dark instead of the strip of road my headlights told me to love. The desert out there carries a separate light, a low sodium glow from somewhere you can't map, probably base housing, probably a plant. And in that brown gold smear, the mesquite looked like it had been arranged by a person with a taste for repetition. Far back off the shoulder, a slat fence ran 10 yards, then stopped, then started again, same length, same angle, and between the slats hung foil bits that should have been trash, but caught the weak glow identically every time I drifted past. The smell shifted too, from creosote and dust to something colder, mineral, the odor of an engine room 100 feet below the waterline. That's how the night tells you you've left the map. The senses stop agreeing with one another. Truckers swap strict advice like old prayers. When lost, get simpler. Big roads forgive small mistakes. That wisdom is sound until you aren't on a road anymore, not by the rules that matter. I let the rig creep and watched the coyote again, same timing, same gait, and then decided to insult the night. Instead of braking, I flicked on the left blinker, a little orange metronome in emptiness, and left it there for the whole pass, tapping the horn twice at the exact cinder crack where I now expected the animal, a declaration that I understood the theater and would not learn my lines. The coyote lifted its head at the second tap. Different. Not much. Enough. It cut a shallower angle and showed me a shoulder scar I hadn't seen. The shrine arrived a breath later than it should have. The billboard, when it came, still begged me to trust their guarantee. But a corner had torn free and flapped once, and the sound was new, a sheet metal, clack out of rhythm with the cattle guard. Loop's bargain. They offer comfort in exchange for obedience. The next offer came as a lone porch light 1/2 mile off the right shoulder, slung low on a double wide that looked freshly set in the soft dirt. The house hadn't existed in the previous passes. Either the desert had coughed it up for my benefit or my fear had. Either way, it presented like an exit. Human warmth, a rectangle of window glow, the rumor of coffee and directions, and a landline with dial tone. It sat too square to the road, though, too stage flat, the way backdrops do when they trust you not to walk around them. Every experience worth living on the highway has an animal sense check, and mine went red as a brake light. In the glass of that lit window, there should have been motion, the sitcom of a life, a TV flash, a person making messes. And there wasn't. Just the idea of occupancy. I took the center line and rolled by at 15, hands light, telling myself, not out loud, that if any shape broke that frame, I would treat it like whiteout and keep the truck between paint. Nothing broke. The light didn't even throw moths. The 5th time past the shrine, the fake sunflowers finally explained themselves. The plastic had a matte finish like old dashboard vinyl, but one petal had a finger smear, darker, oily, as if someone had touched it recently in a hurry and left proof of a decision. I pulled onto the shoulder and walked back with my headlamp and counted offerings. 3 pocket lighters, a paper rosary melted into a bead blob by Summers, a coin I wouldn't pocket. Because superstition isn't a hobby out here. It's armor. Behind the cross, set into the dirt, a rectangle of poured concrete held 4 date stamps. 11:42, crudely pressed, the same minute my dash insisted on replaying. Not a time. A memorial's attempt at a clue, or a mold used wrong. None of it amounted to anything you could hand to a deputy. All of it amounted to a truth. The night was arranging itself around my attention, and if I kept the pattern alive, I'd run freight in this rectangle until the desert decided I was part of its memory of asphalt. Breaking loops. Second rule. Do something unsafe in a safe way. Unsafe, because the pattern requires your cooperation with every caution it hands you. Safe, because the price for boldness is physics. I took the next pass dirty. Straddled the center line at 28. Headlights dipped to parking lamps, so the world's suggested lane geometry gave up. And when the billboard rose, I was already outside its persuasion, hugging the oncoming lane as if racing a ghost rig. The coyote appeared, late now, and I tapped the horn once, not twice, a new language. It changed course, cut behind me, and in the mirror I saw its eyes throw back my weak light in a color I don't have a word for, something between amber and green that looked like approval. The pump house door, that soft turquoise, had a hairline vertical crack that hadn't been there. The foil charms on the fence had twisted a degree. Night tastes are real. This one lost its metal edge, let in sage and old rain. Mileage is a religion. The abuse is in the rituals. At the top of the next shallow rise, the road should have dipped to the same wash, the same culvert, the same guard fence, and didn't. The grade kept climbing, gently, a hand on the back. The porch light broke off to my right and vanished, like it had remembered an appointment. The shrine did not return. The billboard appeared in my right mirror, which is a trick a billboard cannot perform if the universe is behaving. Ahead, a green reflective wink. A true sign, its font state-issued, not counterfeit. Junction 82. My body performed the relief before my mind dared. Breath longer, grip softer, the knowledge of a merge returning like a childhood street after years away. I didn't speed up. I crept, afraid to spook the math. The T intersection was real because it was ugly. The stop line had been ground and repainted twice, ghosts of previous rules peeking through. The pole wore 3 lost pet flyers, laminated against seasons that never wanted them. The way the wind pooled dust at the base of the reflector bolts told me a plow had thrown a wave of sand here last monsoon. Real, not curated. I braked and put the rig in neutral, and sat long enough that the truck reminded me I hadn't set the brake with a chime that was irritating precisely because it belonged to a world with warranties. In the center of the junction, stenciled in white, DOT neat, a triangle with an I, a survey mark, nothing mystical, and under it, a maintenance note. Reset 11:42. A date, a code, a coincidence so perfect I had to laugh once to prove I was still a man who finds things funny. Left took me to the interstate and to a heartland I knew how to argue with. Right would have bent back toward the lights I did not trust, toward fence and foil and unslept houses. The temptation to test it, one more pass, a confirmation, a souvenir detail I could polish later into a story scarier than it felt, was a physical pull in the hands. I went left. The ramp accepted me without commentary. The merge lane offered trucks like brothers, ugly and fine, and the sodium sky ahead carried the proper city stain of Tucson bleeding up from the edge of vision. I set the cruise, not because the leg needed it, but because I wanted the machine to take responsibility for forward. I had done my portion of the night's argument. Let the rig do the rest. At the next fuel stop, the clerk had that peculiarly southwestern mix of amusement and fatigue, and when I asked if the county spur ever gets weird, he answered without looking up from the lotto count. "You mean the loop?" Like we were discussing a frontage road with potholes. He told me some drivers blame the base for frequency soup, some blame the mountains for bending things, some blame boredom, some blame sins. He said a rancher out that way paints his doors a new color every few months to keep the roots guessing, then smiled because he knew I'd picture a man negotiating with geometry in his yard. He pointed at a taped index card by the coffee machine. If the roads repeat, change the thing you do. It was a joke written like a rule. It was also a rule written like a joke. Loops don't always announce themselves with billboards and coyotes. Sometimes they're quieter. The same song on 3 stations as you scan. The same trooper at 3-mile markers. The same ache in the same knuckle at the same county line. Civilization is a pattern we agree to. These deserts keep a second one, older, and sometimes it runs on top of ours like clear water on slow oil. If this was a glitch, it was a human one. Attention snagged on repetition until repetition became the only story the night agreed to tell. If it was something else, it taught without cruelty. It wanted only my cooperation to continue. It wanted my obedience. I gave it novelty instead, and it let me go. That's as close to mercy as a road ever gets. Now, when a stretch feels rehearsed, when the second boulder is the same as the first, when the wind hits the cab with the same tap on the same panel, when the clock shows me its favorite minute twice, I don't speed up to muscle through. I break rhythm. Window down in the cold. Radio off when it wants on. A left blinker in a right lane for 60 seconds. The horn in an empty county like a bell in a chapel. Not enough to die by. Just enough to tell the night I'm not a metronome. It doesn't always feel like anything. Sometimes it feels like a man making noise at nothing. But every time the road changes shape, a hair after. Every time the shrine arrives dirty instead of clean. Every time a coyote looks up, I count it a small win in a long game with an opponent that doesn't know my name and doesn't need to. The rumors about Route 93 talk about wrecks and speed traps and men who don't blink long enough to be believed. They don't talk about the thing that moves under trailers, like it learned our shape from a mirror and kept the parts we try to forget. The first time I felt it was halfway between Wickenburg and nothing. Yes, that's what they call the little scrape of a place up there. As midnight flattened the desert into a black sheet, the wind laid down like it didn't want to be blamed. The rig felt heavier by a degree that didn't show on the gauges, a drag under my feet as if I'd picked up a coil of chain I didn't remember loading. I chalked it up to the slight grade and the psychology of lonely miles. Out on 93, your mind builds furniture to sit on while the road keeps moving. Then the undercarriage camera, a cheap dash cam pointed wrong because thieves like batteries and cable, hiccuped and painted the corner of my in-cab screen with a smear of pale that could have been rock dust or reflection. The smear had joints. It moved wrong, not smooth like an animal that belongs to the ground, but hesitating, adjusting, testing, the way a person crawls under a house when the space is too tight and they might change their mind. I'm not a man for ghost talk. Route 93 doesn't need magic to be dangerous. It has cross after cross planted into the shoulder like an agricultural crop, and every one of them will tell you exactly what happens when physics shows up and takes attendance. But the next mile brought new data that refused to obey shame. A low scrape under the sleeper that drifted left to right, then back, then left again in a rhythm too deliberate to be flapping skirt rubber or a loose strap. I ticked through the mechanical possibilities. Exhaust hanger, fairing, dislodged splash guard, and each one failed the way a lie fails when it tries to cover a detail it doesn't know about. The scrape didn't hit on bumps. It moved when I shifted my weight. I eased my foot and felt it settle into the opposite of my body, as if it were learning to counterbalance me. CB was quiet, a bad sign on that stretch, but the phone had a bar or two, and I queued up a weather report from a station far enough away to be boring, to give the night a rhythm that wasn't mine. The undercarriage feed pulsed static, then offered me 2 frames that I would later try to explain to people who would kindly look away to help me keep my dignity. The pale of skin where the knee meets the shin when a person pulls their legs under them. The low arch of a foot flattened by weight as it slides. Too close, too human. For the first time in years, my hands trembled on a wheel I trust more than any door handle. There's a wide pullout near a wash that locals use to check tie-downs and reckon with their lives. I took it slow, hazards blinking, listening for the sound to persist once the tires were off the line. Bad if it did, worse if it didn't. And it did that. Soft scrape, then a tap, polite, against the fuel tank as if something under there wanted to calibrate how loud it could be before my courage finished subtracting. I set the brake and didn't kill the engine because silence is when old stories feel brave. I stepped down and felt the night seize the sweat at the back of my neck, with teeth cold enough to be personal. The desert had that copper smell of hot metal winding down and a sweetness that sometimes comes off creosote after the day has taken its hand off the land. My flashlight, good batteries, new lens, found my tires, then the step, then the black behind the fairing, and the beam bent back at me off chrome like a warning not to invent a face where none belongs. You don't lie down under a loaded trailer at night on 93 unless you want to risk being remembered for the one thing you couldn't get out of the way of. But I crouched, and I breathed so shallow I got lightheaded, and I asked the night to be a place where my choices were not as stupid as they felt. The light found the cross members, the lines, the dust swirl a rig makes that never quite settles, and then a patch of something pale, not reflective, not fabric, resting against the underside as if pressed by magnet or want. It pulled back the way skin pulls when it doesn't want to leave what it's touching. I went colder. The body has a basement floor you only hit when your mind refuses to say the words it has already formed. I said them anyway. Human. Not a whole one I could see, not anything that would show up in a photo later and win a bet, but parts put together by a mind that understood which ones would make me say human and stop there. Hey, I yelled, because anger is cheaper than fear at the start, and the thing, which is a word I will use only because I have to pick one, responded like my voice carried weight, like I had put a hand on its shoulder. The pale withdrew to dark, and the scrape moved toward the rear wheels, where no light wanted to show me where it went. I stepped left, then right, stupid dance to gain angle, and that's when the smell hit. Not rot, not animal musk, but the clean hospital smell of alcohol, of gloves snapped on, of gauze unwrapped. It didn't belong to dirt. It belonged to preparation. The beam shook, and the shake made the light look alive, and the truck look untrustworthy. The camera feed popped. A frame held too long. A face that was almost a face. My face, if you flattened it into a guess. The adrenaline came so fast the night made a high electrical sound at the edge of my hearing. I stood up fast enough that the world tilted, sat back down on the step so I wouldn't fall, and laughed once because my body needed an excuse to dump something poisonous into my blood that wasn't panic. Cars passed. 2, 3, a cluster, moving faster than the law and slower than ambition, and each set of headlights shaved away a layer of my belief in what I had just seen. You can't convince a person who wasn't there that the dessert will put your features on the underside of your own rig and ask if you approve. There's a way out of these moments that the old men who taught me would never call mystical because they prefer their courage practical. You ask the danger to show you what it wants. You draw boundaries you can enforce. You pretend you are a person who has made bargains before and kept them. So I talked to it. I told the underside of my truck I was going to roll forward 6 feet. I told it I would not stop and look again until I felt the drag leave and the smell fade. I told it that if it followed, it could have the empty space I would create by not insisting on proof. Then I went back inside, knocked dust off my boots, and pulled, slow, wheel straight, eyes on the place where my headlights could not accuse me of superstition. The drag stayed for 2 seconds, 3, then slipped away with a soft pop, like a suction cup letting go of a clean window. The smell held a moment, prepped room, bandage, wipe, then thinned into diesel and dust. The feed on the camera corrected to a respectable grain. The night remembered its chores and got back to them. I put on the blinker, like I owed the law respect for getting me this far, and eased back out into a road that suddenly felt like it had never met me. Maybe that's where a healthy man would end it. Admit he's spooked. Tell the story as a caution about exhaustion and the tricks it'll pull when the mile markers start to feel like cousins. But the desert kept a receipt. A mile up, parked crooked against a turnout sign, an older Peterbilt idled with its hood up and nobody in the driver's seat. The cab light burned, and the passenger door stood open in a way that always means a person left quickly for a reason they're still deciding whether to regret. I rolled slow, horn tapped twice, and a voice answered from under the peat with the kind of calm you hear in men who have not yet decided whether to be embarrassed. All good. He climbed out, hands black with a job he hadn't done, eyes not seeing me even when they looked at me. You got someone under there with you. I said it in a way a man speaks when he knows he's breaking a code. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. The kind you give a stranger who has earned exactly one honest sentence. Had, he said, and then added, me. And the word made no sense until it did. The kind of sense that hurts because it insists you acknowledge a category you didn't want to carry. He nodded at my trailer like we were in on a joke together. They like this stretch, he said, as if we were talking about tarantulas or wind gusts. They wear you till you look like yourself, and then they ask to ride. I should have left him there with his poetry and his hood up. Instead, I killed my engine and stood beside him with the sound of cooling metal making little night ticks between us. He told me he'd seen it 3 times in 20 years, always on 93, always on nights the wind behaved itself. He said if you run with too much of yourself unresolved, you can expect company in the places that know what to do with leftovers. He said the thing never took anything you hadn't given it first. They want the shape you insist you don't have anymore. He said that last part softly, like he was being kind. There's a line the world demands of men who work alone in loud machines. Don't make it weird. Don't make it soft. So I told him about the drag and the undercarriage frame and the smell of preparation. He nodded like a man listening to a diagnosis he already knew. They prep you, he said, for the version of you that keeps going. I asked what he did when it crawled on. Let it ride until it gets bored, or it wins, he said, not proud. Or insult it. Either way, you can't pretend it isn't there once it is. Back on the road, I kept my hands loose and my breathing obvious, like I was telling my own body where it should sit in me. Jaguars of oncoming cars wrote white commas across the glass and were gone. The shoulders glittered with the hardware of memorials that no longer matched their flowers. At Nothing's turnoff, a hand-painted sign leaned into a wind that wasn't blowing. It said honesty in a style that wanted to be a joke and failed. I drove until Kingman made the sky dirty with civilization, put my trailer in a slot that didn't hurt anybody, and went to wash my face in a sink that offered a fluorescent judgment I deserved. For weeks, I didn't check the undercarriage feed at night. I told myself the cable had a loose ground, and the white I'd seen was flare from a reflection I'd invented to keep myself interesting to myself. It worked, until I had to run 93 again, and the same stale, cold, alcohol-clean smell found me just north of Congress, in a windless patch of black, and the scrape staged its first soft audition exactly where it knew I'd hear it. I didn't look. I insulted it. I sang something tuneless and ridiculous, and slapped the dash twice, and took my hat off so the cab would see a different shape of me in the glass. The drag came away like it had failed to get traction. The smell hung around to sulk, and then went hunting for a man who would feed it better. If you want a lesson, here's one that doesn't require believing in anything except what work does to a person when they carry it by themselves for too long. The road will find the versions of you that can still be worn, and it will try them on in the quiet stretches to see if you notice. On 93, the noticing sometimes has knees and a hand that taps metal and a face that could be yours if you let it. The way out isn't bravery so much as refusal, the impolite, unsatisfying choice to deny the night your cooperation. Not every horror out here is an accident or a man. Some of it is the echo of your own outline asking for a ride you're not obligated to give. When people ask, "What's wrong with Route 93?" I talk about traffic and margins and speed and how the desert has no interest in staging a rescue if you enter it with too much faith in your reflexes. I don't mention the nights something tried to wear my shape from underneath and test whether it fit. I save that for men who squint at the shoulder, like it's a mirror, and then decide not to look. I tell them to keep their cab a little messy so the night can't stage its furniture in there. I tell them to insult the pattern. I tell them to keep driving, not because forward is heroic, but because sometimes the only thing the desert respects is motion it didn't arrange. The teeth started as a rumor in the asphalt, a pale chip where truck tires had worried the surface down to a strange white glint, and if it had been just one, I'd have called it quartz and kept my promises to the clock. East of Globe, on an old freight road that locals swear shortens the miles and lengthens your life expectancy in the wrong direction. The surface is a patchwork of repairs done by men who knew they'd never drive it at night. You learn to read a road's biography by how it fails. Spider cracks, sink lips, tar-bled seams that print onto your tires like bad decisions. These white glints weren't any of that. They looked set, deliberate, like someone had pressed them in while the blacktop was soft and told them to wait for me. By the third glint, my foot came off the throttle without asking permission, and by the fifth, I rolled onto the shoulder, where the mesquite throws mean shadows, and the wind smells like ancient coins. Hazard lights stuttered red against the scrub. The night outside the cab had the hollow sound of a church after the service, when even the pastor won't say anything important. Kneeling at the first white spot, I put my fingers on the cool of enamel that shouldn't have been there and felt a smooth crown keyed into grit and oil. A tooth. Not animal from what my hands could tell. The root was gone, but the crown wore a hairline crack like a traveled man's smile. I've hauled cattle. I've hauled produce. I've hauled pallets of things men shouldn't ship after dark. Nothing prepares you for touching human on the road because the road is where we go to be machine. I told myself about pigs and coyotes and what they scatter. Told myself about wrecks, about the way momentum shreds and throws and leaves small testimony in places crews miss under bad light. The story tasted procedural, reasonable. It didn't explain why the teeth followed one every 50 yards for nearly a quarter mile. The spacing so consistent, I could have paced it blind. Each one seated shallow into tar, each one aligned in the same orientation, like small white compasses set to a direction I wasn't brave enough to identify, forward or backward. I didn't test the theory. I tested the tooth. A stupid test. The kind of childish dare you give yourself to prove you weren't spooked. Fingertips working the edge, a twist, a little pressure. It gave with a noise the road shouldn't make, a tiny crackle that snapped through my head with the mean efficiency of winter air in a dry room. In my mouth, an answering sting. Not pain. A sensation. A sympathetic shock to a molar I've had since a dentist in Albuquerque put a cap on a youthful mistake. I spat reflexively and saw nothing but the dark shape of my own disbelief. Back in the cab, I cleaned my fingers like I'd handled something contagious, and the steering wheel felt wrong for a few minutes, too thin, as if the truck were smaller than it had been an hour ago and wanted me to notice I'd made it nervous. The next tooth appeared like a taunt at the edge of the high beams, then the next, and the old freight road went from shortcut to ceremony. The CB hissed in that soft way that isn't company or loneliness, just proof that sound exists. I thought about turning around and laughed once because turning around on a road like this at this hour with this pattern under your wheels is how you get added to somebody else's story. At the crest of a low hill, the spacing widened and the glints multiplied until the shoulder glittered with pale like frost. To the left, a cut where the road crew had shaved rock for the right-of-way and left a naked wall, red and broken. To the right, A shallow arroyo lined with scabby saltbush. Anywhere else the moon would have made the world kind. Out here it made a stage. I stopped in the empty middle and listened. Trucks make a ticking sound when the heat leaves them. Coyotes make night into punctuation. Tonight there was a different layer. Faint, the kind of thin clatter enamel makes when it meets enamel in a glass jar. A shake and stop, a shake and stop. I walked down into the arroyo because some part of me wanted the jar to be a jar so badly I was willing to be the idiot who finds it. It wasn't a jar. It was a spill. Maybe an old 5-gallon bucket overturned by time and washed out by flash floods that had rearranged their contents like the desert does to everything left unattended. Teeth. Dozens. Some with fillings the color of old coins. Some with the smooth perfection of youth. A molar with a hairline as delicate as a map line. There are things you can look at only so directly. Peripheral vision is mercy. In the periphery, they looked like shells. Standing ankle-deep in the basin of gathered enamel, the thought that no good man ever has alone came for me without disguise. How many mouths makes a pile? I backed up so carefully it would have looked like reverence if anyone had been there to judge me. Back at the cut, the road wall threw off a different kind of pale when the headlamp hit it right, embedded pieces between aggregate, set like chips in a mosaic. So old the tar had gone gray. This wasn't new. This was layered. This stretch had been repaved more than once. They build on the bones of what they don't admit. Once you drop into counting, you either get superstitious or scientific. I got stupid. I dug at the edge of one set into the wall with a key, levering gently, almost begging the stone to be just stone. The tiny crackle came again, and in my jaw a patient ache answered, this time with a little more authority. The thought arrived the way bad news does. Inevitable, self-contained. Take one from here, lose one from you. Not a threat in language. A mechanical exchange. The night felt like a room with an old machine in it that had been running long enough the building grew around it and learned the rhythm of its labor. I put the tooth I'd pulled from the road back into the crack I'd made in the wall, and it didn't sit right. It never does when men try to undo a ritual with clumsy fingers. The old freight road runs parallel to a rail spur for a spell, and trains out here are their own congregation, chanting in steel and grease. I hadn't seen one all night, and then the rails began to hum somewhere I couldn't see, and the sound got into my ribs and made a low theater inside me. That's when the practical thought came dressed as mercy. It's a company dump, dental waste. Old clinic up in the mines. Old dentist with a bad conscience and worse habits, disposed of improperly decades ago and resurfacing with every heat and storm cycle. A story permissible to repeat to cops and priests. All it required was willful ignorance of spacing and ache and the fact that I had counted 31 teeth to the hill, 62 to the wash, and had a number in my head I did not want to reach before the long grade. You can stop reading a pattern. You can also refuse to be cast. I drove with my eyes soft past the urge to tally, treating the white chips as a static I would not tune. The CB came alive enough to remind me people existed. Two drivers arguing about fuel rewards like gods about offerings, and in that petty normalcy my jaw loosened, and the dull ache became just the memory of ache. The road widened by degrees I could measure with my shoulders. The teeth thinned. The desert gave up that little clatter like a spoiled child deciding to be magnanimous. Then, around a gentle bend, a wide apron of new blacktop appeared, fresh seal, crisp paint, a rectangle of civilization pressed into the wild-like apology. There was a sign at the far end of the apron with the authoritative font that makes me angry when it lies. Surface repair. A date scissored off by a bored blade. A phone number that would ring at a desk staffed by a person instructed to hear what I could say and ignore what I couldn't. I pulled onto the good surface, like a man who'd been offered clemency for a crime he could not name, and sat with the engine idling in a rectangle of sane for 3 breaths longer than looked cool. It's funny how quickly gratitude turns to contempt. I wanted the road to explain itself, and the sign to admit it knew how to read. When I finally eased back out, a pickup idled at the other end of the apron facing me. County truck. Magnet sign on the door. Guy inside with a baseball cap and a face that had learned how to tell strangers what wasn't his problem. He rolled slow and flagged me with 2 fingers off the wheel, a greeting from men who keep schedules and lies. I rolled my window. "You good?" he asked. "Just checking a noise," I said. He nodded, considered me. "Don't stop on the old section," he said. I waited. He didn't smile. "Kids dump weird stuff out here, and the road keeps what it likes." It was such an Arizona sentence, I almost forgave him for saying nothing. "Who poured this?" I asked, nodding at the apron. "County N.A. friend," he said, and his mouth twitched. "You get a flat?" My teeth hurt, I said, because sometimes the only way to keep your head is to throw it off a little hill. His eyes flicked, not with surprise, but recognition you can't fake in a face that old. "Keep rolling," he said. "Motion's the only thing it respects." He went east. I went west. The road behaved like road again. In the mirror, the new surface shrank into the small grace it was. I let the CB fill with a story about a jackknife trailer up near Superior and an argument about whether dispatch or God had asked too much of somebody. My jaw forgot to be a barometer. My hands remembered how to be bored. It would have been a clean escape if the universe had respected my exit. It didn't. 10 miles later, at a fuel stop that survives because men need coffee even when they hate themselves, I went into the fluorescent and bought the kind of cup that tastes like you deserve to be awake. At the register, the cashier had the brittle friendliness of a person who sees too much midnight and not enough sun. She saw my hands shaking a little and asked if the gravel caught me or the wind. I said neither. I said old pavement. She laughed once and said, "Highway of Teeth," like it was a brand of trail mix. She said I'd be surprised how many drivers arrive with their jaw in their hand and a story about a road that chews back. "You believe that?" I asked, which was mean because I was asking her to carry the weight I didn't want anymore. She shrugged, then set the pen down carefully, like it belonged to a system that punished disrespect. "I believe the county poured 3 times in 2 years, and the white keeps coming up. I believe people pull their own teeth when no one forgives them. I believe crews find things they won't list in a report, because who wants to call a supervisor and explain shame in cubic yards?" On my way out, a corkboard by the door held enough humanity to fill a bus. Base boats for sale, babysitters with perfect grammar, men offering odd jobs in handwriting that made you hear the voice. Tucked in the corner, a dentist card stapled crooked, local, offering emergency crowns. Someone had written "Good with Truckers" in ballpoint above the number. I took the card like a coward takes a relic and slid it into the flap behind my registration. I didn't run that old road again for a while, not because I'm afraid of repeating a bad night, but because repetition is how roads learn you, and I needed to forget enough of myself to pass unrecognized. When I did return, daylight handled the world in a way that made everything look like mistakes men can fix, and the white glints looked more like aggregate and less like proof. The wall at the cut held a new stripe of tar where a conscientious human had tried to seal the pattern under something black and final. The arroyo had no teeth where I looked, and probably plenty where I didn't. I didn't test. I didn't count. I didn't touch anything that would make a sound. If there's a lesson, it lives at the junction of superstition and maintenance. Some roads are made of what we put in them, on purpose or otherwise, and sometimes the land gives those ingredients a job. Maybe men dumped clinic buckets where nobody cared. Maybe crews mixed old rubble into new surface because budgets are stories no one believes. Maybe the desert forgot it's not a mouth and practiced biting until it learned to leave marks. The part that feels true in the body is simpler and less useful. When a place starts taking inventory of you, don't feed it. Don't stop to name it. Don't pretend you can fix it with a key and intention. Keep moving until the pattern finds someone more generous, or until morning. When shame looks like geology again, and you can tell yourself a better story about what lives under the black. The recording started as a joke in Winslow. Scratchy cassette dubs a cashier kept under the counter for truckers who asked about the voice on 19. A local mythology she sold for free because there's no cash register button for Dread. What they had was 5 minutes of screaming that wasn't quite human, words that bent at the wrong joints, and a hiss underneath like wind across an empty plain. The story that rode with the tapes said, "The night those sounds were made, radios across northern Arizona lit up at once with a call nobody traced, and an hour later, 3 rigs signed off mid-sentence and never signed back on. The nights here breed folklore to keep drivers awake. Everyone knows someone who knows a man who heard. Out of respect for the dead and the road, most of us listen and then file the tale in the same drawer as highway ghosts and desert lights." Then, crossing I-40 westbound past Holbrook on a Sunday after midnight, the band went quiet in that peculiar way that means the country itself is listening, and Channel 19 filled with a voice that was not a voice. Skip happens in the desert. The ionosphere does its tricks. CB traffic walks from state to state like a vagrant with a stolen coat. But this wasn't Skip. It was a frequency finding its way into whatever made sound in the cab and deciding the speaker was too small, so it used the air. A syllable arrived, then a second that didn't join the first, then a string of sounds that brushed against words, the way the wind brushes against barbed wire and makes music nobody asked for. It had cadence. It had intent. It did not have language. The recordings in Winslow had prepared me for panic. The real thing delivered something colder, recognition without meaning, like seeing a face you know in a crowd and remembering living with them for years, but not their name. "Anyone else catching this?" a man asked, steady, the kind of voice that holds a room, and 3 drivers answered at once from miles apart. Joseph City, Meteor Crater, 2 guns, stamping the signal as real in the only way reality works out here. Multiple witnesses who know the mile markers. A 4th chimed in from Flagstaff, breathless, then cut hard, as if a hand had covered his mouth. The band emptied like someone had stepped in and flipped a switch labeled hush. When the noise returned, it was thinner, higher, like what a wire might sing if stretched from here to the coast and plucked by a storm. A word resolved, or tried to, help, but it split into 2 notes and fell apart. There's an incident the old hands bring up when CB turns weird. A thing from the 70s called Lost Boy Larry that drifted across the Southwest on a week of strange propagation. A cry for help from a kid in an overturned truck that sent planes and searchers fanning out into New Mexico until the signal died, and the hoax rumors sprouted like weeds around a grave with no body. That story sits in the CB's bones like an old injury. Proof you can hear a thing that sounds exactly like a life ending and still be powerless to help, or worse, a fool for trying. When the not voice on 19 bent itself toward the shape of human pain, that memory came with it like a lawyer carrying case law to a fresh crime. Truckers are good at pretending fear is a root problem. We talk about weather and grades and closures because those come with warnings and plans. This didn't. The man with the steady voice tried again, calling out handles as if a roll call might keep whatever this was in the bounds of the ordinary. He made it through 3 names and then said, "Where'd he go?" without meaning to key the mic. And everybody knew who he meant, the Flagstaff voice that had cut like rope. The hiss thickened. A pattern dropped under it. Clicks in 2s and 3s, not Morse, not old telemetry, more like something feeling along an inside surface for a seam. The CB smelled like hot dust and ozone, the way electronics smell when they've worked too long with nobody thanking them. The right thing to do was the obvious thing. Kill the radio. Let other men do the theater. Keep the rig between the painted questions and live to mock this later over eggs. I turned the volume down, and the sound didn't change. I powered the head unit off and the sound didn't change. I pulled the fuse, and the sound didn't change. It rode the air, thin, insinuating, turning the cab into a tuning fork for a song that didn't need my permission. Out past the glass, 3 rigs ran, staggered like shy friends on a night jog, and their marker lights blinked in a rhythm that wasn't synchronized until, for a few breaths that lasted too long, they were blink, blink, pause, blink, blink, pause, as if a hand outside us had found a way to tap on 4 hulls at once. A new voice came through the mess, small and high, and a corner of the mind that always wants to be soothed grabbed for the comfort of a child in distress, because we know what to do with that. We coordinate. We call it in. We tell the boy to keep talking. We draw the map from the static. It said, "Daddy." But the word had a seam in the middle that popped when it shouldn't. It said, "I can't," then stretched the T so long it turned from consonant to string. The part of me that would have welcomed a kid to save shut off like a breaker. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap with a shape designed to make you bring your heart to it. Past Winslow, the recordings were supposed to be a joke that kept men alert. They were something else now. Notes to a future from an earlier night's survivors. I thought of the cashier's almost smile when she slid the tape across and said, "Some people like to listen alone, and some with friends, and some sell them back like a lucky charm that turned." I thought of how the story went. 3 rigs signed off mid-sentence and never signed back on. Their last words in every dub like the end of a song. You can't get out of your head. I tried to remember the last words and failed because the brain erases what it can't stand to rewrite. At 2 guns, the wind knifes across the road on certain nights, and the canyon breathes the kind of cold that comes from stone, not sky. The hiss on 19 took on the same cold, a subtractive chill, and the not voice began introducing other frequencies like harmonies below hearing. My mirror showed an empty lane until it didn't. A rig where no rig had been. Dark, running no lights, keeping an angle that said either deliberate or dead. It held for 2 long blinks and then was gone, or my mind made it gone because that was safer than adjusting to company I hadn't permitted. The steady voice keyed again and whispered, "Don't repeat it," like a prayer. Then he said the word help, and the channels swelled around it like a tide. Humans name storms and signals, and children because names make emergencies smaller. Whatever moved across 19 refused a name. It tried on ours. Handles we hadn't spoken all night came back to us in a tone that was almost right, saying we were here, asking if we heard, asking if we were there, like a man lost in a cave calling to see which walls answer. A driver out near Meteor Crater shouted that he could see brake lights where there was no vehicle, scattered red like embers in the median, and then his mic fell and the sound came through of hands on plastic, and a breath that wasn't his, too slow, too broad, too interested. The breath went on for a count that dilated time. Then the carrier dropped, and nothing lived on 19 but static and the old song of distance. Between Flagstaff and Ash Fork, the desert turns from flat to forest in a series of decisions the land makes without asking your consent. Pines show up where scrub was, and the air starts smelling the way a childhood house does in winter if your childhood knew trees. Men like to say the trees kept the signal sane. This night, they didn't. The not voice rode with us into the dark fur and found a new timbre to wear. Lower, wetter, like something spoken underwater. It gave us a coordinate that didn't exist and a mile marker none of us knew, and then said the word now with such finality I checked the mirrors for a trooper coming to end my life by procedure. If this were a horror anyone could live in later, there'd be an image, something seen on the shoulder, a shape in the ditch, a costumed idea you could draw and dismiss. Instead, the horror was logistical. 4 men realized at once that calling for help meant telling someone what we heard, and telling meant being told to pull over, and pulling over meant stopping inside whatever was moving, and stopping might be how you got counted. So we did the only thing cowardice and courage agree on in truck country. We kept moving. The steady voice, God bless him, started a dumb conversation about fuel prices 2 states over. and asked if anyone had ever found a real shower in Kingman, and someone else answered with a joke about feet, and it sounded like laughter on a lifeboat, like men moving their mouths to keep the dark from learning the shape of their names. Past Ash Fork, the not voice came one more time, loud enough to make the CB pop and the speakers in the doors thump and the glass quiver. It said a string of vowels that held each other like hands and then stopped so clean it left a pressure behind, the way an airplane leaves a hole in the air where it used to be. The channel filled with breathing. No one keyed to say we'd made it through. We were ashamed to congratulate ourselves for outrunning a rumor. One by one, men started humming. Then one by one we stopped, because that felt like wrapping ourselves in its song. We ran quiet, like thieves. In Kingman, the truck stop had a TV on behind the counter, local news at an hour only insomniacs and men who borrow time watch. The crawl talked about closures on I-40 west of Flagstaff due to weather earlier, and then cleared them with a bureaucratic grace that made the night's weirdness vanish from the record. A driver at the coffee pots asked if anyone else had caught the show up near Winslow. Nobody answered, and everyone took their cups black, like sweetness might attract attention. The cashier had a stack of cassettes under the counter. I didn't ask. She didn't offer. We agreed to be modern men with phones. Weeks later, in daylight, somebody posted in a trucker forum that I-40 west of Flagstaff had gone strange at night. Advice to park or turn around until morning. The comments did what comments do. Traffic, plows, chain laws, jokes, sympathy for kids stuck in cars. And the night we'd shared stayed where the desert keeps its best secrets. In the voices of men who would rather speak of chains than of the way a frequency can try on your name. It's easier to be a cautionary tale about road conditions than the unreliable witness to a sound that wanted to count you. What happened to the three who signed off mid-sentence in the old story? The polite version says they turned their radios off and kept driving west until the tape hiss ran out, then sold their rigs and bought boats or bought guns and decided to love different roads. The rude version has them parked in every truck stop gossip and every cashier's rumor drawer, men whose last words wear thin with retelling until the vowels don't fit in the mouth anymore. The truth is smaller and meaner. Sometimes men disappear without help from legend because the road asks too much, and the night offers a choice between a story and a sleep at 68 miles an hour, and the wrong one feels like rescue for 3 seconds too long. What to do if the voice finds you? Don't repeat what it says. Don't ask it questions. Don't pull over to give it a better chance at being explained. Fill the cab with a trivial call about where to park in Gallup, or who still changes oil without a lecture. Let your voice be a fence made of small, stupid boards it can't be bothered to climb. And if the channel goes quiet in that specific way where even weather seems to listen, remember the old rule the country has always taught its drivers. Motion is prayer. Keep the truck between the painted questions until a gas station's bad coffee and worse light make the horror look like a trick you'd feel silly to name. If this unsettled you, there's more waiting where miles turn into stories. Subscribe to Verified Souls and ride along for the next descent into the dark.